policeman crosses all boundaries by brutally assaulting a little girl named Layla right in front of her mother, Naomi. No one expected Dwayne Johnson, who happened to be in Lakeshore Park in the city of Briarfield, to step in and fight back hard. What happens next becomes a turning point that changes everything. The sun was high in the sky, casting warm golden rays over the vibrant green expanse of Lakeshore Park. Families had flocked to the open space, taking advantage of the clear weather to picnic, play, and enjoy the peaceful ambiance. The rhythmic laughter of children mingled with the soft rustling of the tall oak trees. Among the crowd, 7-year-old Layla was the picture of joy as she chased her friends across the playground, her braids bouncing with every step. She paused only to call out to her mother, who sat nearby on a worn wooden bench, watching her daughter with a smile of quiet contentment. Naomi, a single mother and a librarian by trade, cherished these moments. Life was often a delicate balancing act, juggling long hours of work with raising Layla on her own, but today was a rare respite. She had brought along a paperback novel, one she'd been meaning to read for weeks, but the book remained unopened in her lap. Instead, she was focused on her daughter, who was now scaling the monkey bars with the fearless enthusiasm only a child could muster. The tranquility of the moment was disrupted when Naomi noticed a man in uniform entering the park. At first, she didn't think much of it. Officers occasionally passed through the area on patrol, but something about his demeanor felt different. He wasn't strolling or interacting casually with the parkgoers. His steps were purposeful, his expression tight, and his eyes scanned the playground with a sharpness that made Naomi uneasy. Her discomfort grew as the officer's gaze landed on Layla and lingered. Layla, blissfully unaware, had reached the top of the slide and was cheering herself on for her small victory. The officer adjusted his stance, then began walking toward her. Naomi's heart quickened. She stood up, her book falling from her lap to the ground. Layla slid down and hopped off, only to come face to face with the officer. He loomed over her, his towering frame casting a shadow over the small girl. "You," he said, his tone cold and devoid of friendliness. "What are you doing here?" Layla blinked in confusion. "I'm playing," she said in a small voice, glancing toward her mother. Naomi was already moving, her legs carrying her across the playground with urgency. "Layla," she called, her voice firm but laced with concern. The officer turned slightly, acknowledging her approach, but his attention remained fixed on the child. Without warning, he grabbed Layla's arm. The movement was abrupt, startling both mother and daughter. Layla let out a small cry of pain and fear as she tried to pull away. "Let me go," she whimpered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Naomi demanded as she reached them, her heart pounding. "Let her go. She's my daughter." The officer turned his steely gaze on Naomi. "Step back, ma'am. This is official business." Naomi's fear was quickly overtaken by anger. "She's a child. She hasn't done anything wrong." She reached for Layla, but the officer's other hand shot out, pushing Naomi back roughly. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of other parents and park visitors. Phones began to appear as people started recording the confrontation. Layla was crying, her small body trembling as the officer's grip tightened. "She doesn't belong here," the officer said, his voice sharp and accusatory. Naomi's hands balled into fists. "What do you mean she doesn't belong here? This is our neighborhood park. You have no right to treat her like this." The officer's expression hardened. "Step back," he ordered again, "or I'll have to detain you too." Naomi's voice rose, cracking with desperation. "Detain me? For what? For standing up for my daughter? Let her go." The air was thick with tension. A crowd had formed, murmurs of disbelief and concern rippling through the onlookers. The once lively atmosphere of the park had turned into something oppressive and heavy. And then, cutting through the noise, came a voice both calm and commanding. "That's enough." Heads turned toward the source of the voice. Striding toward the scene with deliberate purpose was Dwayne Johnson. He had been spending the afternoon at the park with his daughters, enjoying a rare moment of downtime away from his busy life, when he heard Layla's cries. His protective instincts kicked in immediately. The officer glanced at Dwayne, clearly unimpressed by the newcomer's imposing presence. "Stay back," he barked. "This is none of your concern." Dwayne's expression didn't waver. "You've got a terrified child in your grip," he said, his deep voice carrying authority. "That makes it everyone's concern." Layla, still in the officer's grasp, turned her tear-streaked face toward Dwayne. Her sobs quieted slightly as she took in his reassuring demeanor. Naomi looked at him too, relief flickering in her eyes. She recognized him, of course. Who wouldn't? But in this moment, it wasn't his fame that mattered. It was his presence, his willingness to step in when no one else dared. Dwayne stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady. "Let her go," he said, his tone firm but controlled. The officer squared his shoulders, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so openly. "This is a police matter," he said. "Step back." Dwayne took a step closer, his sheer size making the officer seem smaller by comparison. "A police matter?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She's a kid. She's scared out of her mind, and you're the one doing it. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" The officer's jaw tightened. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "No," Dwayne agreed, his voice calm but unyielding. "But you do have to answer to all of them." He gestured to the crowd, which had grown larger. Dozens of phones were now raised, capturing every second of the encounter. The officer hesitated, his grip on Layla loosening slightly. He looked around, realizing the weight of the scrutiny he was under. "Let her go," Dwayne said again, this time more firmly. The officer's hand released Layla's arm, and the little girl stumbled forward into her mother's embrace. Naomi held her tightly, whispering soothing words into her ear. Dwayne stepped between them and the officer, his presence a wall of protection. "You crossed a line," Dwayne said, his voice low and measured. "You don't lay hands on kids, ever." The officer bristled, his face red with frustration. "You think you can just walk up and play hero?" he snapped. "This is my job. Your job is to protect people," Dwayne shot back. "Not terrorize them. If you can't tell the difference, you don't deserve the badge." The officer looked as though he wanted to argue, but the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the park's edge, and several officers stepped out. Their expressions shifted as they took in the scene. The crying child, the distraught mother, the imposing figure of Dwayne Johnson standing his ground. One of the new officers, a woman with a calm yet authoritative presence, approached cautiously. "What's going on here?" she asked, addressing the first officer. "This man interfered with police business," he said, gesturing toward Dwayne. The female officer's brow furrowed. "What business?" Before the first officer could respond, Dwayne spoke. "He grabbed this little girl," he said, pointing to Layla, who was still clinging to Naomi. "Scared her half to death for no reason. Her mom tried to intervene, and he pushed her away." The female officer turned to Naomi. "Is that true, ma'am?" Naomi nodded, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "Yes, my daughter was playing. He came over, said she didn't belong, and grabbed her. She's just a child." The female officer's expression hardened as she looked back at her colleague. "Price, is this true?" Price, Officer Price, as he was now identified, shifted uncomfortably. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. "She looked suspicious." "Suspicious," Dwayne echoed, his disbelief evident. "She's 7 years old." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. The female officer raised a hand to quiet them. "We'll sort this out," she said. "But for now, Officer Price, I need you to step aside." Price opened his mouth to protest, but the weight of the situation and the presence of the cameras seemed to give him pause. With a sharp nod, he stepped back, though his frustration was evident. The female officer turned to Naomi again. "Do you and your daughter feel safe to leave now?" she asked. Naomi hesitated, glancing at Dwayne, who gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll be fine," she said softly. "I'll make sure of it," Dwayne added, his voice firm. As Naomi and Layla began to leave the park, escorted by a couple of the officers, Dwayne stayed behind. He watched as Price was questioned by his colleagues, his stance tense but composed. The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, exchanging stories of what they had witnessed. By the next morning, footage of the confrontation had gone viral, sparking widespread outrage and calls for accountability. Advocacy groups seized on the moment, using it to highlight broader issues of bias and abuse of power. Dwayne, thrust into the spotlight once again, used his platform to speak out. "This isn't just about one incident," he told reporters. "It's about making sure no child ever has to feel unsafe in their own community." For Naomi and Layla, the aftermath was a whirlwind of attention and support. Neighbors and strangers alike reached out, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Layla, though still shaken, began to regain her confidence with her mother's unwavering love and the knowledge that so many people had stood up for her. And while the journey toward justice was far from over, the events at Lakeshore Park became a catalyst for change, not just in Briarfield but far beyond.